My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, as Cicero said, no one is so old that he does not think he could destroy the osmotic balance in those that might seek to challenge him, or something along those lines. It's Wet Grandpa.
Our first segment is a basic crawl. Wet Grandpa is a 32-page scenario for D&D-esque games. It was written by Evie Lockhart with art by Anxie, editing by Jarrett Crater, and layout and maps by Corey Bryn and Christian Kessler. The contents of the book begin with the player's introduction, in which the players acquire a copy of a treasure map from a man with a, quote, breath like onions and soured beer. The map is marked with symbols representing Fatfish Village and the River Way. There are also notes for the Naiad Treasury and Blood plus Game plus Gold. The referee's introduction is next. It gives us the backstory of the Tolling family, headed by Bridget and Jedlin Tolling, who have adopted 14 stray children from the area. These children refer to them as Grandma and Grandpa. Bridget eventually dies, and Jedlin drowns. Except Jedlin's fish-bitten corpse crawls back home and wishes the children good morning. He is now referred to by the children as Wet Grandpa. This section also contains some info about what happens mechanically should a party member fall in the river themselves. Next, we have some details about the village of Fatfish, a blighted place owing to the fact that the fish have basically dried up. This section contains notes about the survivors, i.e. the handful of families who have stayed in Fatfish, and a timeline that breaks down exactly what happened to the village going back 50-odd years.
Next, we have a section dedicated to the Mudwater Naiads and their many treasures. There are 4 Naiads who are collectively the spirit of the River Way. 2 of these are active, one waxing and one waning. The other 2 are, at any one time, waiting in their treasury, enchained. The next section is a small dungeon that acts as the Naiad treasury, including the stats for the Naiads themselves. From there, the text moves on to Jedlin, who is now a strange and horrifying watery undead. We get his stats and some notes about what will happen if Jedlin is not destroyed, principally that he develops a very powerful hydrokinesis. We also learn the fate of the 14 grandchildren. Speaking of them, we also get stats and details for them in the next subsection. The last section is an encounter chart for river travel, which details a few random encounters. So, experience with the module. I've only read this thing. Jason, how about you?
I have played it as a one-shot using Trophy Gold. I will note here that this was the fastest, most ramshackle Trophy Gold conversion yet. I basically took the little map, drew some lines bisecting the different parts. Those little parts became my sets. I wrote a set goal for each of them, but otherwise ran it straight out of the book, and it worked fine. It was literally a 5-minute conversion.
Nice. Actually, speaking of the book, I think in the interest of transparency, we should say we did get sent a free PDF of this by Jared of Melsonian Arts Council, but judging from my lack of running or playing the thing, maybe that didn't make too much difference. No, I did like it, but didn't get around to it.
I didn't realize that and bought a copy, so ethically we're in the clear. So
Really, good for you.
Things we liked about Wet Grandpa. Tom, what do you think?
Okay, let's talk about the artwork first, because actually, the cover art is sort of an outlier because it's a weird photo montage thing, but inside it's all Anxie all the time, and it's this high colour, borderline outsider art stuff that often is commenting on the text it's next to, and I really like it. There's something weird and energetic about it. No, not energetic. Alarming? No. I don't know. What is it?
I agree. I think I had a very strong emotional reaction to the artwork. For the cover art, at least, there's this sort of collage thing going on, and then the interior, it looks like it's all just kind of drawn with magic marker. Yeah, like you said, there's like sometimes commentary about what's going on in the picture, which is pretty great. I was just really sold on the feeling of the module through the artwork. The cover especially, it just has a jarring quality. It depicts like the grandchildren, and it depicts the Wet Grandpa, and then it has like a little background of like a wave or something. It almost has like a a Monty Python quality to it, where it's just like these little pieces that were just taken and kind of pasted there to make this idea of Wet Grandpa and his grandchildren. Like, and the Wet Grandpa, we know he's wet because the hands and face have been colored blue with a marker. Right? I had a very strong reaction to all of the artwork. And I think that's kind of the best you can hope for with something like this. And I definitely liked it more than if it was just a traditional illustration.
I mean, can you imagine?
It wouldn't have had the same effect.
It wouldn't work.
You know?
No, can you imagine this being done in standard 5e style? No, right? It just...
No, yeah, it would be weird. It would definitely be underwhelming. Because this sort of like basic grim proposition of the setting requires something that is equally jarring.
Right,
and I think that this artwork does a good job of that.
And it is grim as well. That's another thing to like about it. It's properly... I actually got a bit upset reading some parts of it. Like, I think in a way that, you know, strangely, something like DCO didn't, maybe because it was a natural disaster, but just the human bad stuff happening to the kids and families in the history of the village. I did find, I'm not saying it like moved me to tears or disgust, but I found it quite upsetting in some places.
It is very grim. I like that about it too. Yeah, it definitely had a similar flavor as that beginning part of Deep Carbon Observatory, the part where like you mentioned, there's like this natural disaster that floods the village. But yeah, you're right. There's something about this, about the fact that like it was just a gradual decay based off economic hardship.
Yeah.
It somehow makes it more real in a way, or more tragic.
Yeah, it feels like these missed opportunities somehow, you know?
Yeah. I actually have a little quote here just to sort of demonstrate like how dark this gets. So we are told at one point that Jarnan Green, Heron's father, died of flu 6 months ago. The Styxes took Dana in without question. Dana was a Green. Shortly thereafter, the whole household took ill. Only Dana and Haran survived. Out of desperation, the teenage girls turned to shunned God's Eye berries for sustenance. They found an awakening instead. There was a world of spirits beyond their failing flesh, whispering timeless and maddening secrets. This made the necessary steps much easier. Under a river of tears, the girls butchered their fallen family, preserving the flesh in salt. It's very dark.
It is dark, yeah. So that's true. It's not like grim and gritty in the sense of a Mike Leigh up north kitchen sink drama. So there's bits of, there's fantasy adventure and weird Grand Guignol in it.
Yeah.
The village community, the way what's left of it, the way it's depicted, and the kids on the island, they're quite nicely laid out. It's very simple. It's a 1-column layout. It's only a short book, right? But there's just enough characters there to be I assume, you can correct me if I'm wrong, fun for the players to kind of wander around and interact with. And
yes.
They're not like massively different from each other, but they have personalities and stuff.
That was the bulk of our session. I would say 75% of the session was just the player characters interacting with the village. And they enjoyed it. They had a great time. I had a really good time role-playing all those characters because that's something I like to do. It was a very, very interesting setting. I don't think that the players were interested in hanging around once it was over.
Mission accomplished. Good.
Indeed. But no, yeah, it was. It was definitely, it was the highlight. I feel like as you read this module, like before I started to run it, I got the impression that different groups are going to like different things about this. And some groups are going to be really into the village, and other groups are going to really be into the naiads. And my group, it ended up being more about the village. And I think that makes sense because of the way I like to run games. I'm a fan of the sort of decrepit village story.
Yeah.
I think that they really kind of got into the very human drama of it. Like you said, inflected ever so slightly with a sort of Grand Guignol quality, but like still a quite human sort of thing.
Obviously, this is a very pro-Decrepit Village podcast, but I did, and
right, yeah.
Something that sort of did stand out to me was when I was reading it is that the naiads, who are these sort of immortal beings with fabulous treasures and a pretty cool seasonal waxing and waning thing, that's quite nice, and then the island with Wet Grandpa, and then Fatfish Village, they do seem kind of unconnected from each other. Like, it felt to me like a group could easily not really interact with one or two of those things, except that there's the river encounter table as you're coming in the intro section, which I think does a good job of showing the elements of what's going to come. And then I guess if you're the GM, you know sort of whichever one interests the group most when they bump into it in a rowing boat is going to be the one that's the most of the adventure would be about. So Yeah, I think that actually the river encounters table is buried at the back of the book, but it's kind of more important than it looks, I suspect.
Yeah, not for my game that I ran. It was an intentional one-shot for me, and so I knew I had to get like certain things done, and so I basically just picked one encounter off that table and kicked off the session with that, and then went straight to the village from there. That was kind of how we did it.
Oh, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I don't think you'd have time for it in a while. I think if you were doing a mini-series, maybe 3 sessions, you'd want to give
if you do the whole thing,
session
it's about 2 or 3 sessions, for sure. Awesome. Anything else you liked about it?
Well, I do like the naiads, actually. On the first read-through, I found them a bit maddeningly vague, but on the second read-through, I got it. So, like, it was it was pretty cool. I like the fact they have different animal forms when they're chained inside their treasury, when they're not the active ones. They have different animal forms, and they're not the animal forms you would expect. You know, it's not river stuff. It's bears and massive crows, which is pretty cool.
Well, bear's a river thing, right?
Yeah, kind of. I've seen bears in rivers, yeah. But giant crows with glass eyes, not so much. And
cougars, not so much, right? Yeah. The last thing I'll say about things that I enjoyed about this is the map itself, this little treasure map that the characters get in the beginning. It is a masterwork of green and blue magic markers, best I can tell. With some nice little symbols and things scrawled on it. Highly functional. I just thought it was, I don't know, it actually was really functional. I mean, and for me, like I said, I literally drew lines on it to make it my trophy gold set diagram. But
honestly, I love it. I think it's the perfect handout. It's just enough detail to be useful and to get you into trouble. It shows you the village, shows you where the island, which end of the island to go. Yeah, it's really great. And the
Naiad
little
treasury.
It says it right there. It's wonderful. And then the little scenario of how you get it is pretty good as well. So 10 out of 10 for that map. I loved it.
Questions we had about Wet Grandpa. Why don't you start?
Okay, so I have a question about the Grandpa Jedlin's adopted kids, the 14 kids that live on the island with him.
Right.
In their descriptions, it says where they're normally found at certain times of day in many cases. Did you make notes sort of ahead of that, or would you if you were maybe not running it in Trophy Gold in a one-shot? But I think I'd want that on hand when I was GMing, not kind of stuck at the back. Like, you need to, when they land at a jetty or something, you need to know which kid is there, not flipping through. So did you have to prep that, or was it not much of an issue?
I actually did prep that. I did take like just a couple of quick notes about the kids, where they could be found and kind of what their personalities were, just because, like you said, I didn't want to be flipping around in the middle of it. But not too many notes, mostly just enough to, okay, once the characters get here, what are some of the first things they can encounter?
Yeah, what's the first thing they see, right?
Yeah. So I did make a little short crib sheet, very, very short, just enough to sort of like get things going and not be flipping around the pages or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's my only real structural problem. There's also like a forward reference at one point where it starts referring to the kids by their category names, which you haven't read yet, but again, it's a short book, so you could just go back and figure it out. If it was longer, that would be annoying, but it's okay.
Did you have another question?
My other question is about the naiads. So I think I need to explain this a bit for the aid of the listener. So the deal is that depending on the season, the 2 inactive naiads are chained up inside their treasury in a different cell for each one. Like, they have sort of thematic chambers that they're chained up in. And the other 2, one is waxing, presumably the one who is in the first half of, if it's the first half of spring would be waxing, and one waning, presumably that would be winter. But they are free from the treasury and immensely powerful. So how did that play out in your game? Because they seem like the biggest emergent play kind of wild card, and there's a lot of lore about like, they can absolutely destroy you, but if you challenge them to this a contest of skill or might, then they might go for it. That's one of those classic hard for the player characters to find out without dying things.
Well, funny you should ask, because if we were playing a more traditional role-playing game, I think that is a very high possibility of what would have happened. They encounter. So I had the bear and the crow as the active ones, and you could imagine a situation where they encounter this big powerful bear, and they encounter this big bear, and they like try to kill the bear or in some way, but then the bear kicks their ass or whatever, right? Because it's a god. You can imagine this going, a little sideways. In Trophy Gold, of course, for each set, you have out of character knowledge, which are the set goals. And I made one of the set goals, learn what the naiads want. And so straight away, the players know that the naiads want something. They have some sort of aim. And that set goal, combined with the fact that they know that there's the naiad treasury, made the players think, okay, there are naiads here. We should be on the lookout for them. Maybe we should even ask around and find out what we can find out about them. But ultimately what ended up happening is they ended up going into a negotiation with the bear and the crow.
Yeah.
And that's when the naiads told them, we really want Jedlin dead and destroyed because it's a problem. Because that's what they want, ultimately.
That makes sense. And actually, that's a good point. You mentioned the Naiads' treasury. That's written on the map.
Right.
So even without the trophy gold thing, you do know that, you know there's Naiad treasure. You don't know where it is.
You know there's Naiads. You know there's treasure. Right, exactly. Yeah.
So, okay, that makes sense.
So it's a little bit like having your thumb on the scale a bit as far as play outcomes, but it led to a great story, so I have no complaints. I mean, and ultimately, it's the story that the module wants you to be doing. The module wants you to go face off against Jedlin in order to negotiate with the Naiads and get their treasure.
Yeah. And in fairness, like the Naiads, one of the things that they don't want is particularly to fight and kill some random humans who've shown up, right?
Right.
So that's not on their agenda, so they would... There's a lot of options, I suppose, but I'm always a bit iffy on when you have backstory like that, like who's going to tell them that bit of the waxing and waning, for example? It
didn't really come up in our game.
Yeah.
I don't even know if the existence of 2 other naiads even came up in our game.
No, that's sort of the thing that kind of slips out roughly in session 2 normally, isn't it? Someone mentions it offhand and then...
Yeah. I mean, I just think it never came up, and it had no impact on our story. I mean, I think it's okay for there to be things in the world that the player characters don't understand.
Oh yeah, no, exactly.
Right?
We definitely talked about this as well. Like the idea that if you, there's this sort of poisonous idea that if you don't experience everything in the module, you failed. But that's not the case at all. You know.
Yeah. And we talked about it after the fact. Like I was like, oh, just so you know, there was 2 other naiads, and this is how it works. But we did that as a play group.
Cool. How about you? Any queries?
Yeah, I have one. Do you think Jedlin killed himself? Now, the text says that he had a seizure and fell into the river and drowned.
Yeah.
But for some reason, I don't know if it's just like tropes of the genre that this module is vaguely playing with or what. But as soon as I read it, I got this like, no, he didn't. He jumped in the river and killed himself because he was sad about his wife being dead.
I mean, as soon as I assumed he didn't kill himself. And then I think based on what's in the text, if you take that as read, then no, he didn't. But of course, in play, that's going to be pretty vague, right?
Right.
There's going to be some ambiguity. I wouldn't be definite about it to the players. Who's going to ask him? That would be rude. So I think if they ask any of the kids, maybe they say they saw him out by the river near the dangerous rocks or whatever. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential ambiguity there, which is...
Yeah. I mean, I like it as an ambiguity, so I think that's cool. But I was just curious what your take on it was.
I think the only evidence we have for it is text written by an unseen narrator who none of the characters can ever encounter, and therefore, practically speaking, it could be that he killed himself and it didn't take. Although, wouldn't you be more annoyed? No, I guess not. He's come back as something weird, not something regretful like that.
The whole situation is kind of fundamentally eerie because he dies, drowns. We're told that the drowning takes longer than he wants, right?
Yeah.
We're led to believe that it's painful in some way. That also made me think that he killed himself because he expected it to be a certain way.
Yeah.
And drowning did not meet his expectation. And then he just comes back. And then the kids don't know what to do with him, so they just adapt in the way that kids so often do, just adapt to things, right? I mean, it's just such a weird, eerie premise, and I kind of love it.
It is weird, yeah. I would hope that someone in your fantasy adventure party would have a way to see that scene happen, through a vision or something.
Yeah, it's a shame that it happens off screen. Yeah.
Oh well.
Let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom, start off.
Okay, I like this bit in the Styx's former residence. Quote, madcap mushrooms hang upside down, drying above the sill. The girls don't know why. The twisted hob that sings into their ears each night does know why. No further information is given about this.
Nice. I love the picture on page 7. It is a triple exclamation point picture. I don't know. Listeners, just go look at it.
Yeah,
I'm not going to try to describe it.
To describe it would not do justice.
Yeah.
I like the treasure map. I also like the island map on page 13, which has no legend or explanation of any kind. It just, you're just expected to recognize the shape of the island and the river, and it uses shapes and what you kind of already know to tell you everything. Here's where Jedlin died, here's the treasury, here's the house. It's brilliant.
I like this fine quote. Wet Jedlin don't care to say much, but his brain is always running. It was that way before, too. Mostly now it plays back his wife's freshly dead eyes and his own terrible drowning. Sadness and fear haunt his living corpse. Always.
Speaking of the twisted hob, all of the move descriptions are kind of interesting for the various creatures, but this one I like a lot. Move. Like an old man if he thinks pity will help. Otherwise, like a scared cat.
And finally we have this charming quote. No one remains in a dying village for happy reasons. Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. We are talking about portraying elderly characters. I'll note, it's maybe not such a big deal for this module, but
maybe
I'm taking the opportunity of Grandpa being in the title and an old man figuring prominently in the story to springboard into this conversation about portraying elderly characters, which is something of a hobby horse of mine in tabletop role-playing games. I did write a whole game about playing old people. So, portraying elderly characters. Any opening thoughts, Tom, before I get going? I have a lot of notes here.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of have a bit of the old light premise questioning, which I'm pretty sure is going to be the reply to which is probably going to be the crux of your thesis here anyway. But is it meaningful to talk about portraying quote-unquote old people as a block? Like, I mean, should we not be approaching this like, if we said playing young characters, does that mean anything particularly either? I'm not sure that we can. Help me out here. How do we usefully approach this?
No. I think you're right. I think your gentle rejection of the premise of my expert delve is, in fact, the answer to the expert delve in a way. Mm-hmm. So here's the deal. I think it's very easy to play old people in a way that is a caricature, and sometimes those caricatures can even be downright offensive, such as like the dragon lady Chinese old woman or the hectoring Jewish grandmother, that sort of thing. But there's some very common sort of tropes or caricatures that we see in gaming especially, and other types of fiction for old people are, for example, the Harbinger character. That's particularly salient for fantasy games. The old crank that waves his gnarled hand and warns the player characters to stay away, that kind of thing. You've got that character. You've got the sort of like deranged or nosy neighbor. You've got the sort of old battle axe, which that's kind of an offensive term in its own way. Sometimes they're doddering old fools, or they're gossips, or they're in a more modern sort of game, they're like hopeless Luddites, or they're old witches and fortune tellers. There's just all these like sort of like ways that you can play old people that kind of come up. They're a little tropey. And in fact, there's actually nothing wrong with some of those. Like, the old witch or the old fortune teller.
Old witches are awesome. What's, I mean,
the old witch and old fortune teller, a total staple of fantasy gaming. Nothing wrong with that. But, depending on this context of the game, you might want something a little more nuanced, maybe not in a fantasy dungeon crawl, but maybe in some other type of role-playing game, which our remit allows us to talk about here on Favorite Black Dragon, right?
Yeah.
I think that those caricatures of old people have their place. They serve a purpose in the story, of course. How can you play these elderly characters in ways that are a little bit more fuller and more nuanced? And this is, I think, especially important if you as a player are playing an older character, or if you have an older character as the GM that figures prominently as an NPC in the story, like the sort of central character. And I think it's helpful to consider the life that such characters have lived before the player characters encounter them. What has been their journey up to this point? You don't have to spend a huge amount of time thinking about it, but, it helps to consider where they came from. In my own game, Brindlewood Bay, it has a built-in system for prompting the players, all of whom play elderly women, for prompting the players to think about how their characters are women, not just old women, and what came before their life in Brindlewood Bay. You have to consider their joys and their triumphs, but also the ways in which they were imperfect mothers, imperfect daughters, that kind of thing. And even Wet Grandpa, as maudlin and fantastic as it is, even Wet Grandpa has an emotional core to it. Jedlin had a wife that he loved, and he raised a bunch of children with. Mm-hmm. He actively avoids harming the grandchildren while he's in his zombie form, although we learn that he may inadvertently harm them later. But he kind of like actively tries to avoid that, right? Because he still like loves them. I just think that that's one thing to keep in mind is what were they like before? What is their emotional life? And then kind of like moving on from that, perhaps even more important when you're playing an older character is to consider the fullness of their life right now. We don't like to think about it, but our parents and our grandparents have romance. They have sex. They have hobbies. They have friend groups. They have, in short, desires and motivations that operate outside the boundaries of what we want them to be doing. And I just think that's important to consider for these characters.
Yeah, and it's good that you bring up Brindlewood Bay as well, because one of the things I particularly like about that is that at different points during the game, after you've done the intro about like your former life and your deceased partner and your family and stuff, is you keep interrogating the former life when you do certain things. Basically, you have a flashback, or you know how to do something because of something you did before. And it's sort of revealing or reminding or whatever. The murder maven that you're looking at here is she's not just that lady who's into gardening
right
from the town. She's also did this stuff before, but she's also not only what she used to be, which is always the classic thing when, the nephew in a Murder, She Wrote or whatever shows up and...
Grady.
Yeah, I was thinking of like, secondary characters, like when the one who's only in that one episode, it'll be like, you didn't used to be like this before, auntie, and it's no, because they've moved on. So she used to be like this, but now she is the lady who likes gardening, and you didn't know that, like she didn't do that before. And to not make this purely a Jason Cordova promotional podcast, I've sort of been thinking about that a lot recently, because I'm running an ongoing game of a relatively obscure thing called Tribe 8, which is a post-apocalyptic fantasy game from the late 90s, early 2000s. And although the main characters are not that old themselves, it does deal a lot with ideas of oldness. All the player characters have been exiled and shoved out to an island in the middle of a river by their former society. And there are different generations of people there, and some of them are old enough to remember when all of the humans in the area were herded into concentration camps by weird aliens, and some of them are old enough to remember things being different in the days before. So there's often this very interesting interplay between people like remembering what they used to be like when they lived back with the 7 tribes, and the people they knew from their former life when they've both been exiled and how they've changed, and then talking to older people and like understanding how there is like certain knowledges and skills that they would never be able to attain because they simply did not experience these things, and those times are not coming back. And that's been really interesting, and we're constantly talking about what was it like before you came here, before you got exiled, and asking that question of the PCs and pretty much everyone that they meet as well. And I think that sense of barriers that you can't maybe leap over, but you can see over or talk about, that's important, I think. It's not saying everyone's the same, because they're not, but the differences are not that huge.
Yeah, that is one way of centering an older character in the community of your setting, to where they have special knowledge, where they are elders of some kind, they're wise people. And I think that's a sort of portrayal that we see a lot of older characters, maybe not so much in fantasy gaming, but definitely in different types of movies and fiction.
It can be a bit passive though, can't it?
That's what I was about to say. I like it when we're playing an older character and we get to see them dating and having relationships and having romance. I remember the first time, this was a number of years ago, but I decided to play an older woman in a game. I don't remember what the game was. It was something in a somewhat modern day context. And I wanted to play an older woman, and I made her a sexual being. I gave her like desires. I gave her, her physicality was an important part of her character. And I think the other players had a hard time with it, because I think we have a hard time as younger people comprehending older people in this way. I don't know why that is, but we do. And I think pretty much ever since then, I've been kind of like hung up on this idea, maybe because I myself am getting to be an older person.
Yeah, surely that's part of our interest in this thing, yeah.
I know, yeah. It's like, gosh, like we don't just like become, we don't just wither away into nothingness, like.
Let's consider this a rallying cry to play older characters. Yeah. I mean, and also there's, lest we forget, there is the, in fantasy D&DS games, the aging heroes reuniting for one last job is pretty cool as well. And like the 10 years later, even if you haven't actually played the previous campaign that was set 20 years earlier, just start with them old, and that's always good.
Right. Okay, so here's one last thing to talk about. And I don't have any notes here because I'm mostly curious what you have to say, and I have my own thoughts, but I don't know, we'll see. When you're playing an older character, how do you feel about physical or vocal characterizations at the table? Do you do anything to embody the idea of playing an older character?
I don't think I do that much, unless you're doing the classic. If it's a lightly comedic game and you're doing the well, when I was a young man, kind of with wavering voice.
Right,
But
yeah.
no, like in general, I don't think I do. What I do though, and I'm kind of thinking on my feet here. I think what I do is I think more about the words I'm choosing. Like I don't deliberately use archaic slang, but I do try to avoid. I think about roughly how old someone is, and I try to match the way they talk to that. But that's like by no means a science, because I'm improvising while I do it, so I'm sure I get it wrong.
Yeah, I mostly just play them like I play any other character, but if there's like a particularly ancient, frail character, I will maybe hunch my body over or go into that quavering voice thing. But for the most part, I play older characters just like any other character at the table. So, or embody them the same way, characterize them the same way. I think that's all I wanted to say. It's more of a call to action, I think, than any particular practical advice here. But thank you for letting me be on my soapbox for a hot minute.
I thought that was pretty practical, actually. So that's all good.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Let's go to the next segment. It's the companion adventures. I have a ton of game things. I think I want to knock those out first, if that's okay.
Cool. Yep.
Well, so Brindlewood Bay, obviously, please go buy it. We're so close to gold seller status. Oh my God, please go buy it. It's all I want. I don't care about the money. I just want that little badge on my page. It's a game of cozy murder mysteries and Lovecraftian horror. It's Murder, She Wrote meets The Shadow over Innsmouth, and you're going to love it. All right,
it is really fun. I've run it a bunch. Everyone loves it within like 10 minutes. It's so good.
Yeah, thank you. I've gotten lots of good feedback on it. Thank you. Also, I want to highlight a game, which I don't even know if it's easy to get a hold of anymore. It might be, called Obachon Panic. Regretfully, I can't remember the name of the author, but I jotted this down kind of in a hurry. But it was a Zine Quest 1 game, and it's about playing super-powered little old ladies fighting off aliens and monsters and things. It's kind of fun. It kind of does this idea of older women being full characters, but like from a sort of exaggerated superhero kind of standpoint, right? So, but it's good fun. I also want to, kind of shifting back to Wet Grandpa specifically, I want to say that I think Scenic Dunsmouth is a good read here, and I'll note that I think Zarkov is putting out a version that is not tied to Lamentations of the Flame Princess. If you have a concern about supporting Lamentations for whatever reason, you can maybe keep an eye out for that non-Lamentations version of Scenic Dunsmouth. It's a great module. And then also Deep Carbon Observatory. I think Scenic Dunsmouth and Deep Carbon Observatory all three of them, they feel like three sides of the same coin or something. Like they just feel they have so many similarities to each other in tone, in presentation in some sense, in setting. I mean, there's just like a lot of similarities there. They're swimming in the same pond. Did you have a game recommendation?
I do have one. It's a bit tenuous. Something Stinks in Stilton, also with art by Anxie on the cover, if I recall correctly. And it's another tale of rural life gone wrong, although perhaps a little more grotesquely than...
Very wrong, yeah.
I mean, yeah. It's about evil cheese, basically. And but no, that's all I really had. You'd already taken my picks. So
very well. Film and TV. What do you have?
All right, for film, and this is specifically about, what are their names? Is it Haran and... the two girls who have killed the family.
From my quote, yeah.
Yeah. So specifically for that reference, I've got the film Heavenly Creatures from 1994, based on a true story of two girls in New Zealand who got kind of super emotionally, not the same relationship as the NPCs in the book have, but very emotionally, intensely involved with each other, sort of semi-inhabited fantasy world, and ended up doing a murder. In fact, as part of their sentencing, separated for life, and I believe one of them became a successful murder mystery writer in Canada, but I forget which one. And so, yeah, that's specifically for that relationship and the intensity of it. Heavenly Creatures is a good watch, and it's fairly rural as well. I think New Zealand in the 50s in a small town, And then for TV, I have Century Falls by Russell T Davies of new Doctor Who fame, which is sort of, in many ways, reminds me of this, but set in a kind of like 1990s south of England, I want to say, so a more densely populated area. Doesn't have the isolation that Fatfish does. And it's about this girl who moves with her mother to where her mum grew up, that's it, this village. and there are two twins there who live at the local manor house. There's like weird, maybe psychic stuff going on, and spoiler alert for a TV series that is going to be very hard to even watch. It turns out that the nanny is actually a psychic tulpa projection created by the villagers as a way to try and redo a ritual they messed up in the 1950s. Very weird. And honestly, it's really hard to find now. I think I'm not so much recommending this to people who haven't seen it, as I'm trying to remind people who might have watched it on TV around 1992 that it existed. But very creepy and pretty interesting. So if you can find it anywhere, Century Falls, I would say, is worth a look for that very, again, that kind of hothouse village life where everybody is constantly involved with each other kind of feeling.
Yeah, I had a film also from 1994, like your film choice, The Secret of Rowan Inish. I had actually spent some time remembering which movie this was because I saw it as a teenager, but I vaguely remember liking it. The thing I specifically remember is that it was a good depiction of a sort of fishing village with supernatural secrets. It also has a kid in it. I'll add here that, so it's a Selkie movie. I'll add here that there's a whole line of Selkie movies. Many of them came out around this time, and they're of varying degrees of quality, so just be careful when you're like dipping your toes in the Selkie genre. Read some reviews.
There's a lot of Selkie myths. I'm surprised that there was a Selkie boom in the mid-90s.
There was a Selkie boom in the early to mid-90s. Yeah, it was a thing. Yeah. There was another Selkie movie like in, I want to say it was like 2009 or so. I can't remember the name of it, but I distinctly remember this like Selkie movie. And I remember thinking then, oh, we're back on Selkies. So anyway, that's our show, listeners. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We are on Patreon. If you'd like to support Fear of a Black Dragon to make sure that we can keep making this show, go to patreon.com/gauntlet and make a pledge. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks to our edifying editor, Rich Rogers.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.
Hello listeners, I want to tell you our next Gauntlet Community Open Gaming event will be happening the weekend of October 15th through the 18th. This is a free tabletop RPG online con with a variety of games. This October event will feature panels and workshops, as well as sessions of everything from Swords of the Serpentine, to Passion de la Passiones, to Trophy Dark. We're lucky to have gaming veteran Jim Crocker overseeing things this October. Event signups will open Thursday, October 1st at 10 a.m. Eastern. Gauntlet Community Open Gaming is free and open to anyone. You can check out the current roster of events and register for the con on our calendar site at gauntlet-con.firebaseapp.com. All sessions will be run using tabletop safety tools and follow our Gauntlet Community Code of Conduct. We want to offer a safe and inclusive environment for play. You can find out more at our website, gauntlet-rpg.com, in our online gaming section. If you're interested in running sessions or have an idea for a panel or a workshop, you can message the Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG or Jim Cocker directly at Jim Likes Games. Gauntlet Community Open Gaming is a great way to jump into online role-playing and find a new game to try out. We hope you'll join us the weekend of October 15th through 18th.